A very good afternoon to all the panelists and attendees. I welcome you all to the 17th webinar hosted by Asst Palakkad. I am Anita Roy, moderator for today's webinar, and joining me is Mr. Arun, who will be helping us on the technical side, and Mr. Rajat Jose will be documenting this session. Language is not just a medium of communication. It is the medium that helps us to construct our everyday world, grasp the social reality, and acts as a representational tool to our innermost feelings, desires, fears, and expectations. There is a close connection between language and cognitive development. In a multilingual country like India, English has been variously described by educationists and politicians as an imposition of the colonial rule, a gift, or the last legacy of imperial power. This webinar discusses about the topic from English in India to Indian Englishes, challenges and implications for educators. To deliver the session, we have with us today Dr. Reenu Punnoose, Assistant Professor, Humanities and Social Science Department, Indian Institute of Technology, Palakkad. Dr. Reenu received her BA degree in English from Stella Maris College, her MA in Applied Linguistics from University of York, UK, and her PhD in Linguistics from Newcastle University, UK. She taught briefly in the Linguistics Department at the Central University of Kerala. Her areas of research interest include, but are not limited to, experimental phonetics, sociolinguistics, bilingual language acquisition, and world Englishes. We are extremely privileged to have you with us today. A hearty welcome to you, ma'am. Dear participants, you can post your queries related to this webinar using the Q&A option. Dr. Reenu will be responding to these queries towards the end of this webinar. So without further delay, let's begin today's webinar. Once again, I welcome you all, and over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. Before I get you into the world of English in India, I want to say that I've taken a little bit of freedom and tweaked the title a little bit. When I gave in the title, as happens, and I started to put together this talk, I realized that I had to be a little more specific. And so if you noticed in the poster, it said from English in India to Indian Englishes, challenges and implications for educators. And if you can see on my screen, on your screens now, sorry, you'll see that I've added a linguist's take. So that is me being specific, and also it's a little bit of a disclaimer that, you know, this is a huge area and there are many ways in which you can look at this topic. And I want to specify that my take, I'm a linguist, and my take is that of a linguist. So let me get you straight into this. So today the session, I have it's divided into three sections. It's going to, you know, briefly take you through an overview of the history of the language in India, what started as a colonial, imposition, and how it's grown into these many dialects, both regional and social. So we'll trace that journey. I know that many of you may already know this, the history of the growth of English, but bear with me as I give this a context. I'll try and be quick with that section. The second part is going to tell you about why and how the 90s, the 90s decade and what followed after is a very significant turning point as far as the evolution of English is concerned. And also then connect that with how school education enabled what I call the vertical spread of English. And then the last part will tell you a little bit about some of the key challenges and implications for educators to take away to consider in the wake of this vertical spread. So, where the story begins. So I think again, I'm probably going to repeat things that you already know. It of course all started more than 400 years ago when the East India Company arrived in India in the early 1600s. And then many of us are familiar with the name Macaulay and his infamous minute upon Indian education, in which he waxed eloquent about the inherent superiority of the English language in comparison to languages spoken at the time in England. And he very, again, infamously said and talked about how, English is the need of the hour and how English must be made a language of instruction in India. And said that, that there is a need to produce a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, moral, and intellect, right? And this quote, of course, is rather infamous. And if you see on the right of your screen, I mean, the images are not that important, but while I'm talking, you can glance through some of the material I've put on there. There is the Governor General of that time. So this is the 1830s. So we've traveled very quickly over the span of one slide to 200 years. I'm trying to make this less boring and quick. So in 1835, the English Education Act came into effect. It was put into effect by the then Governor General, William Bentinck, and essentially, making it official, making of English as a medium of instruction in institutions in British India official. That's what that did, right? Now, we're going a little further ahead in time. And this is now taking us to the time when when the independence movement was on in full swing. And it's interesting, many researchers have commented about how educated Indians at the time didn't really have an issue with using both English and their mother tongues. They didn't see that they didn't see the use of the English language as being a sort of betrayal of their cause for a free nation. Instead, they saw the use of English as having certain advantages in furthering the cause of a free nation that they were all involved in. So, bilingualism, in fact, was something that was very common among educated the time. So before English came to India, it was very common for educated people to be bilingual. So apart from your own mother tongues, it was common for you to know Sanskrit or Persian, for that matter, right? And so, you can see a picture of Gandhi and Nehru there seated together. Sorry, Gandhi and Tagore there seated together. And we know Gandhi, Nehru, and Tagore all used English very confidently. Tagore, of course, we know this, translated, himself did the English translations of his Bengali poems, going on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 1913, I believe. So, and of course, these are just a handful of names. There were so many others who were very confidently using the English language, many Indians who were using this and writing rather eloquently. So, that's the freedom struggle and the independence movement and how English was used to further the cause of a free nation. Now we again further ahead in time to when the Constituent Assembly debates were happening. So this is in and around the time of our independence and a little before we became an official republic. So that's the duration we're talking about. And many of you may or may not be aware that language was one of the topics on which the fiercest debates were held in the Constituent Assembly. There was a lot of to and fro. Nehru acknowledged that, while English was very useful in uniting nationalists across the country, and of course, it also exposed Indians, to science, to advancements in science and technology across the world. But he was very anxious that English should not be allowed to dominate the linguistic scene in the country, because he was very aware that a minuscule of people knew English in India. And, it was a minority who knew it. And if English was allowed to dominate, it meant that there would be a class of elites who were very separate from the mass, the large mass of Indians who, of course, didn't know English. So he was very aware of this. Now, the other interesting angle to this is, of course, again, quite well known that there was huge opposition from the southern states to Hindi being made the national language. And so, many felt that for them, it didn't matter whether it was Hindi or English, and English had some more practical purposes. And so they said, why should we learn yet another language in the form of Hindi? We would rather do with English. And they opposed what they saw as a sort of Hindi chauvinism. And English, in some sense, was used to mollify both parties, and largely, of course, the southern states. And then Hindi, there was no national language. There still is no national language. Hindi was made the official language, and English was made the associate official language. That initially it was done for 15 years, and the idea was that within that time, you know, the use of English would fade, and Hindi would, through active promotion and incentive and goodwill and some amount of persuasion, that Hindi would develop enough to become the language of the masses across the country. Right. So now we go 15, 20 years ahead from where we were. And so we're now in the mid 60s, or the early to mid 60s, and Hindi did not develop as much as many hoped it would. It did not become the language of the masses across the country. English continued to dominate in all public arenas: educational, social, administrative, judicial, and there was a renewed attempt in around the time this 15 years window was coming to a close. There began to be a renewed demand for Hindi to be made the national language again. And of course, the southern states said, nothing doing, we're not allowing it. Of course, the very famous anti-Hindi agitations that were held, and notably, although they had presence in some states across the south of India, Tamil Nadu, of course, became, in some sense, known for the anti-Hindi agitations. Southern states put their foot down, said we will not have it, and Hindi cannot be representative of the entire nation. And they were also concerned that this had certain economic implications, so that it would become necessary to know Hindi if you wanted a government job, and this would have far-reaching economic consequences. So for all of these reasons, they were against it. And so in the official language policy that came out a new policy that came out in 1963, that 15-year period that initially English made associate official language for was extended indefinitely. Right. And we come to the 1990s. The 1990s is a very interesting decade for many reasons. As far as the English language is concerned, I'll take you through why this is such a turning point. Now, we know that in 1991, the liberalization reforms came into effect, which essentially means that the Indian market opened itself up for private and foreign investments in several sectors, including health and education. Right now, it was also the 90s were also the time when the internet was founded, and because the internet was founded, the major people involved with the founding of the internet were based out of the US, and therefore no surprises then that English became the founding language of the internet, in a sense. And India, so all of these two things combined together meant that the India and the world became increasingly connected, right? And there obviously or naturally there was a huge demand for English medium education, and as more and more Indians wanted to cement their place in this global, increasingly global world, right? Right. So, let me take you through some of the more specific consequences of these reforms. So, one of the things that happened due to increased private and foreign investment in the education sector is that there was an unparalleled increase in the number, not just the number, but also the kind of private English medium schools that were being established across the country. So, you had everything from what are called low cost private schools to what are called IB schools, the International Baccalaureate, which are these foreign boards, which are based out of, I think, somewhere in Switzerland or Geneva or somewhere like that. I'm actually not, I can't quite remember the details. I think it's somewhere in Switzerland. And and so you have these, anywhere, the tuition fees being anywhere from 200 rupees a month to to maybe 2 lakhs a month, right? So you had a huge variation, and they were all calling themselves English medium schools. Again, you can imagine that there were huge, extreme differences in the quality of infrastructure, the skill sets and recruitment policies involving teachers, how the curriculum was implemented. uh, the and also the kind of students who are attending these schools. So their social linguistic and economic backgrounds, there were huge variations in these aspects, right? And so the kind of English that these different schools were giving their students access to were quite different, right? Because of the reasons that I mentioned in the earlier point. So this gave rise to regional as well as social varieties of English. Now I'll explain very briefly what I mean by that in the next slide. Okay. So social varieties are also called sociolects in linguistics. And what has happened is, so if you look on the left of that slide that I have there, I've written regional variation. Now, this is something that has been there from the time English first arrived in India. So, whenever it's only natural. So, whenever English came in contact with a specific regional language, it would have an effect on the way you used English. So, for example, Tamil English, Malayali English, Punjabi English, Hindi English, which is now also called Hinglish, Bengali English. So you have these varieties that very quickly came into effect, right? And so, this is something we know of. This has even been studied by linguists and educators. Um, what is new in some sense, or a relatively recent phenomenon, or in the last, say, 10 to 20 years, is what I'm calling the social variety. So the social variation that started to come through, that is starting to come through in the way English is used in India. So Indians, like I just said earlier about the point with schools, you have now more people who know or have access to the English language, but all have different kinds of access to the English language, right? And it's the case since the 90s that it's no longer a luxury of the elite in some sense. Access to the English language was no longer a luxury of the elite. It had started trickling down the socio-economic hierarchy in a sense. Unfortunately, didn't get hasn't obviously gotten to the bottom of that ladder, but it started trickling through it wasn't any longer something only the upper middle class or the elite could afford to have, right? uh, so a very simple example that I've given there is, we even if you take a regional variety like Malayali English, or for, let's just say English the way Keralites speak, it's not one variety. Not every Malayali will speak English the same way. The accents will differ, the slangs might differ, the vocabulary, the grammatical constructions may or may not differ depending on what kind of school they studied in, what kind of teachers they had, what kind of language backgrounds they have in their homes. All of these would have an effect on the kind of English that they know and use, right? So this horizontal variation is something that's linked to geography, and vertical variation is linked to a socioeconomic hierarchy, right? So that's what I mean by that. Now, I want to tell you. So, this what we've done is I've told you why the 90s are a turning point, and as far as the growth of English is concerned, and I told you about the effect it had on schools, right? So, I want to talk a little bit more about schools now. Schools, not just schools, and this is well known in um, you know. Other branches of study as well. Sociology, for instance, where this is it's a very well-known fact that educational institutions propagate or reproduce social inequalities, right? And schools, um, in that sense, are no exception, right? And whereas before it used to be the case that it was a question of whether someone had access to the language or not, now it's a lot more complex and layered. It's not just a matter of whether someone has access or not to English. It is about what kind of English somebody has access to. So that is the level at which the inequality is present, right, in today's day and age. And from a linguistic point of view, the schools are also interesting for another reason, right? The in linguistic literature, we call the adolescent age group as movers and shakers. They're called as the linguistic movers and shakers. And what that phrase means is that they are the ones who are in the forefront of, coming up with language innovations. So a lot of the change that you see in languages tend to, not always, but often start from this age group. And there are many, people have given many reasons for this. And one of them is the fact that, at that age, you start to, your friends, your peers start to become very important. And more important sometimes than your family, depending on your circumstances, and they start exerting a lot of influence on your behavior, which includes your linguistic behavior or your language use as well. So that's why this age and this age group is considered a very important one in linguistics. And so schools, you get that age group in, of course, a school. And the other interesting part with respect to Indian English is that if you think of the 90s as the decade when these all these different kinds of private schools were being established, um, you know, and you're giving it time for, say, uh, the influence of this to seep into the English language. The present day adolescents in urban India were all born, if you sort of do a simple math, were all born in the early or mid 2000s, right? So it's very likely that the English that they use a lot of information about the kind of changes that liberalization has brought to English. Now, schools, therefore, are a great source of information on what are the ways in which presently, the English language is being used. What are the changes in progress? They're a very great source of, they can give us a lot of information on that, right? And it's, if you think about it, as far as policy, educational policy is concerned, schools are perhaps the most effective intervention site, right? And I say that also because, again, those who are familiar with language learning or teaching will know that there's something called the critical period hypothesis, which is essentially that there is a critical period, there is a critical age range beyond which learning or acquiring a second language is reported to be difficult. So even if you keep that in mind, the most effective policy interventions can take place at the school levels to actually an outcome that we desire. Now, so I want to sort of take you a little bit into looking at some of the some features of the English language curriculum in Indian schools. Now, before I do that, I want to acknowledge here that when we talk of English education in India, it's not just the language. There's also the literature. Because of the time constraints, there's no way I can discuss literature. And as a linguist, my view on that would not be a complete or a comprehensive one anyway. So I decided to stick to English language. And English education in India for a long time has been bifurcated into language and literature, right? So we're going to focus on the English language curriculum and look at some of, like, a few highlights of the recent frameworks that are in place, right? So there's something called the National Curriculum Framework, right? And the last time revisions were made were in 2005. And the next one is expected in December 2020. And it's a whole document. And again, it would have been impossible to address or pick out all of the pertinent features there. But I picked up three that I thought would be meaningful to discuss in this context. And I have them there on the slide in front of you. So, and we'll discuss each of these in the upcoming slides. So the first point is that according to this framework that was revised last in 2005, the focus, they say, should be on function and meaning and not on grammatical forms, right? They also advocate, sort of cultivating learning environments rich, communicatively rich, input rich, right? As it says on the slide there. And also stresses on the importance of using authentic materials. And we'll come back to this point of authentic materials. There's also a very pertinent point that's made about the importance to bridge the gap between English as a subject and English as a medium of instruction. This is also something that we'll briefly look at. Right? So these are the three that I want to talk a little bit more about. Now, these features so we'll start with this, focusing on function and meaning more than grammatical forms. This then um, sort of poses a challenge for our ideas of correctness. This notion of correctness becomes problematic in such an approach because now we have so many varieties of English, like I was just telling you, the effects of this liberalization, the rise of private schools, all these new kinds of Englishes emerging. When you have so many Englishes, how do you decide what is correct? Do you need to decide if that? So there are a couple of questions that come to mind. How does one define what is correct English? Is there one correct way of speaking or writing English? Um, and I think this is something that we will all relate to. If you think about it, perhaps the most afflicted out of the four skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, perhaps the one that is plagued most by this notion of correctness is speaking. I mean, I think, like I put there on the slide, you just have to think of the kind of accent judgments we all tend to make, even casually, subconsciously, very often. We are capable of passing judgments on the way someone speaks, and this happens more with speech than perhaps with any other skill, any of those other three skills, right? If we keep, if we try and think of correctness not as something that is unchanging and rigid, and instead think of it as um, fluency, as related to fluency and intelligibility, maybe that's the way forward. But then there is also the additional responsibility of ensuring that there is an objective way of evaluating these. Now, um, I would be very, if there are any school teachers in the audience, I would love to hear from you when this talk is done about, if there are rating scales that are currently being used in schools. I would be very happy to hear of this. I know that there are fluency and intelligibility rating scales that linguists have designed that are in use in general, but I don't know about the Indian scenario, and I would be very happy to hear if there is something like this being used, and whether it's or not. Now we go on to the second point, which is this issue of authentic materials. Now this is something that that's worth a discussion, because authenticity, the way I interpret the authenticity of instructional materials, is on two levels. One, if you remember that point, out of the three highlights, there was a point about bridging the gap between English as a subject and English as a medium of instruction, right? Now, what does that mean? What do I mean? Or what does, it was there in the national curriculum framework. What do they mean by that? And my understanding is that, that English learning would be, or teaching would be more effective if the instructional materials can focus on concepts and topics that are covered in other subjects, right? And not just look at it only from a literature point of view, but the instructional should ideally cater to concepts that are covered in other subjects, and that way the learning becomes more functional as well, right? So it's English with, in some sense, what you call functional, uh, not quite, but okay, what some people would call functional English. So English where that, you can see a clear goal to the English learning when you're relating it to other subjects. It doesn't, it only have to be science, technology, it can be any subject for that matter. But bridging the gap between English as a standalone subject and English as a medium of instruction. So this is one level. The second level of authenticity is, where, again, this is my interpretation in the context of what I've observed about the diversity in Indian Englishes, is that the instructional material has to be representative of the socio-linguistic realities of English in India. Right? We're talking of largely being able to communicate, the average Indian wants to communicate with other Indians, of course, abroad as well. The world is getting smaller. If the instructional material is not relatable, if it's not situated in the reality, the social linguistic realities, in the diversity that is Indian, or the plurality of Indian English, then it's not going to be very effective, right? And so, as I mentioned on the slide, what we need is we need more authentic data on what users of Indian Englishes, um, what you and I, what children today are doing with the English language, what is the nature of the varieties that they are using, what are the features, right? We need more real authentic data on this in order to be able to create authentic instructional material, and that's what we don't have. We don't quite have that authentic data, right? Now, the other thing that I also want to discuss here is, I think something again that I would really like to hear, once I'm done with the talk. I would be very happy to hear from teachers, who day in and day out do this in the classroom, and your experiences. I find that, in for a lot of reasons, that listening and speaking skills have not quite gotten the same kind of um, prioritization. A lot of lip service is paid to this, but I mean, in terms of implementation of the curriculum, the listening and speaking skills seem to have suffered the most, right? And it's actually quite unfortunate, because what we need to realize is that, if any so other than first language learning, whether it's second language learning, third language learning, second language and third language learning, the process is very similar to that of first language acquisition, right? So when I say it's similar, what I mean is, if you may all have noticed how children develop um, their language skills. So either you may have your own children, or you have neighbors who have kids, cousins, your own younger siblings whose patterns you may have noticed. In the first 3 to 4 months, the child, an infant, is only listening, right? It's not doing anything else. It's listening. And then it starts to produce cooing sounds, babbling sounds. Then the first set of syllables come in. Then you have the first word. Then you have two words. Then you start having phrases. So it's a gradual build up. But what happens first is only listening, right? And so it's almost like you cannot produce a language. You cannot speak a language that you do not, right? It's really it can be put in that simple a line. You cannot speak a language you do not understand, and so the understanding comes from the listening, right? And so it's very important for second language learners. For those of you who don't understand the terminology, L1 is first language learning, or and L2 is second language learning. So it's very important for second language learning to for us to focus on giving students training to listen, right? It's absolutely crucial, and this should be followed by activities that promote speaking, and then reading and writing can all sort of join in. Now, I've noticed in my when I was researching for this talk, I looked up school curriculums, whatever I could find online. I couldn't find as much as I would have liked to. And again, I'm very happy to hear from teachers who will know and what happens. But it seems to me that many school boards in India, at least in the higher classes, I don't know what happens in the, I'm not sure of exactly what happens in the primary level. In the higher classes, for instance, you have assessments where 80% of the marks is devoted to reading and writing. And then there's 20% for listening, speaking, plus assignments and so on. And this is also, I mean, it's internally assessed. The other is, they go and sit and do your conventional exam. For the 20% that is listening, speaking, plus assignments, it's internally assessed. I can understand that there are many practical reasons as to why that is the case. Uh, but what's also interesting is that the criteria for assessing this 20% is not very clear. At least it wasn't very clear from what I could gather in my search. But like I said, if there are school teachers who have their own opinions on this, and this I find um, interesting, and problematic that if our criteria for assessing whether 20%, I mean, the 80-20 in itself needs to be reevaluated, in my opinion. But even in the 20%, how are we grading them for speaking? Are we giving them an overall grade? Are we giving them, how are we defining levels or grades? On the basis of what? What is our reference point? So, and not having an idea or having a very ambiguous idea about this could or is very likely, leading in many places to these two skills not being effectively taught, right? Now, I want to move on to talking to you about what I see are some of the ways forward um, from the point of view of mix, right? One thing we definitely need, in my opinion, is we need to encourage, at the research level, there needs to be funding, there needs to be encouragement for linguistic investigations of the variations that are happening in Indian English, right? What are the changes that are going on as we speak? What are stable variants? What is changing? What are, you know, the larger community's views and perceptions and attitudes towards our own varieties of English? All of these information we need. We also need, you remember the point about authentic data in order to create authentic instructional material. So we need speech and text corpora that specifically built for ELT or English language teaching purposes, right? And this ideally should be based on our varieties of English, right? And and this sort of also then I keep thinking, will we find variety or varieties of Indian English that we can then realistically incorporate or develop into to be part of a realistic pedagogical framework of ELT? Is that possible? And we won't know till we have the data. Right? So the data is absolutely essential, whether to create instructional material, whether to understand where we are at with this language, what are the brilliant ways in which these dialects, social, regional, and so on are emerging. Now, um, this last bit is sort of based, I mean, this is some of my observations based on some of the latest policy recommendations. So, this is what you see. There are 4 slides. Whatever you see in red on these slides are direct quotations from the latest draft of the National Education Policy 2019. And as it currently exists, and I think it's awaiting revisions. So this is not final. But I thought some of these were very interesting, and I thought I must bring it and share it with you today if you yourself may not have seen this. So I'll just read through and then add my comments as I go along. So it says English has no advantage over other languages in terms of expressing thoughts, right? And I agree, true. English has no specific advantage over any other language. Now, next statement is, moreover, Indian languages are very scientifically structured and do not have unphonetic, complicated spellings of words and numerous grammatical exceptions. So this is sort of Indian languages being compared with English here. And this is a perception. This is not a linguistic fact. As a linguist, I can assure you that no language is more scientifically structured than another, right? So this is interesting that this is appearing in a policy draft. Um, Here's another one. Since independence, the economic elite of India have adopted English as their language. Only about 15% of the country speaks English, and this population almost entirely coincides with the economic elite. Now, again, this I find quite, I think this, I- you know, two comments that I have here are, of course, everything that I've said so far is sort of contrary to this, because I'm saying, I'm not denying that English, having access to English is a big deal, and it's still something that is associated with, your social economic, where you are on the ladder. But having said that, a lot of what I have said today is to say that there has been a vertical trickling down of English. It hasn't, unfortunately, reached all the way down. We know this. Like we're saying, only 15% of this country has or knows English to some extent. Um, that's approximately 200 million people, and so I don't think it's sort of fair to say that it's only the economic elite of India that have that use or speak English, because it seems a little outlandish to me to suggest that 15% of the country is part, is sort of economically elite. And again, the emphasis there being on economically elite. I would understand if it was culturally elite, but economically elite seems a little outlandish, 15% of the country. And so it's unclear what they mean in this draft by this phrase economically elite. Maybe my understanding and their understanding are very different, but I thought that was worth sharing, right? The other thing here is, okay, the other point that I want to share is it talks of why. So it does have a section where it says that, English must be taught. So this is that bit. In particular, taking into account the enhanced abilities of young children to learn languages, and to help break the current divide between the economic elite and the rest of the country. In addition to teaching languages native to India, English must also be available and taught in a high quality manner at all government and non government schools. The emphasis should be on functionality and fluency. Now, again, I have at least 2 points here. One, this so it's made to seem that the only reason English should be learned is, one, of course, to reduce the gap between the economically elite and the rest of the country, and the other is because children are, as we know, the children, the brain development, or the cognitive abilities, rather, would be a better phrase to use. The cognitive abilities of children mean that they are able to learn very many languages in that early stage, in early childhood, right? So why not? So it's made to look like these are the reasons why one should learn English, which again is something I'll comment on in the next 1 or 2 slides. This undermines, nowhere do you see a mention of the role of English in India as a lingua franca, as a link language. You and we all know that English um, is one of the biggest roles that English plays in India, is that it connects speakers, you know, languages native to the Indian subcontinent that you and I don't know. So, if we don't know, many people who, if you have English in common, you switch into English. So it's one of the biggest roles that English plays in India, that of a lingua franca, and that finds no mention, or even any kind of mention, direct or indirect, in that quote. And the other thing is, this takes away, there's also no mention of the role of English as a global language. There is a sentence a little later on in the draft about that, and says that, it's not as much of a global language as we thought it would be in the 1960s. Now, that may be true. It's true that, the global appeal of English seems to be diminishing, with the rise of China, with the kind of technological advancements we have in terms of translation and so on and so forth. But I think it's safe to say that English is not going anywhere in the near future, right? It still has a global presence, and it's not going to disappear or vanish in the near future, at least. Um, to not account or to not mention that is also, and to not acknowledge that, that is also a good reason to introduce English at an early stage to in the curriculum, is, I feel, again, undermining the benefits of English, right? Now, another point is, students whose medium of instruction is the local or home language will begin to learn science bilingually in grade 8 or earlier, so that by the end of grade 10, they can speak about science both in their home language and English. So now this is, if you remember the point we mentioned about bridging the gap between English as a standalone subject and English as a medium of instruction, we said that it would be useful I said that it would be useful to have instructional material that covered concepts and topics in other subjects. So this is now sort of, bringing increased gap when it says that, let students be introduced to science in the home language, which is fine. I don't have an issue with prioritizing the mother tongue at all. But to only do it in the mother tongue till grade 8. So the average age of a eighth grader, according to the Indian education timeline, so we are saying 12, 13 years old. And so, then the understanding is in 2 years' time, they'll be able to, sort of manage to talk science in the home language as well as in English. When they are introduced to science in English at 12 or 13, in 2 years they manage to be very comfortable using it in English. Is again, I think, not it's not a linguistically sound thing to say. It's definitely going to further it's likely to further the gap, at least, between as a subject and English as a medium of instruction for science. And I think more worryingly, it would prove disadvantageous for first generation English learners, for whom we have to remember that the only source um, of learning English and the only avenue to use English is the school or is the educational institution. So for students like that, this kind of a policy could prove disadvantageous, right? So I want to clarify that I'm not saying that we must not prioritize the mother tongue. Absolutely not. I think there are a lot of benefits to studying in your mother tongue. Then that's not what's being debated or discussed. The concerns that are being raised are to do with the fact that if we know about the multilingual benefits, then it's okay to not sidetrack English. Students can learn both at the same time. Maybe that's the way in which this needs to go ahead. So, you know, there is an acknowledgement that English needs to be taught in a high quality manner. Nobody is very clear about what it means to teach English in a high quality manner. But like I use this word sidetrack. Any attempt to sidetrack English is going to prove disadvantageous and going to have counter effect. And the reason I see is this: the elite uh, is not dependent only on educational institutions to provide them with English language instruction. So, if English continues to have a global appeal, you don't offer it, you somehow impose, or sort of reduce the importance given to English in schools, the elite will find other avenues to send their children and to make sure they learn English, right? And again, the weaker sections of society are the ones to struggle with this and will fall behind and sort of propagate this whole linguistic divide all over again. So which is sort of counter, sort of the opposite of what is desired with this policy, with this recommendation. And so the other thing to remember is also that, and this is a more, perhaps works at a more subtler level, and this, that if you describe or you define the goal of learning a language, in this case English, and if you're not associating that goal with something positive that the language has to bring to the table, then it's very likely that it's going to prove very difficult to motivate or to sort of implement in any effective manner uh, classroom practices that give you the desired outcome. So if so, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is, if the goal of learning English are not associated with anything positive, the recommendations don't seem to um, show English in a positive light, as far as why one must learn it, and that's then very likely to translate into very unmotivated classroom practices, um, you know, and that would defeat the very purpose of learning anything, let alone English, right? So, I want to make a case for Indian Englishes, and let me give you some facts that many of you may already know. So, India is said to be the second largest English speaking country in the world. Nearly 11% of our country speaks it to some extent. This is as per the 2011 census, and that's approximately 129 million people. And we're not saying that 129 million people all speak well or not very well. We're saying it's varying degrees of proficiency, but it's safe to say that we've made English our own. And it's one of the interesting things that I want to mention here is, for many of us, the Oxford English Dictionary is the Bible of the English language. If you want to check if something counts as English, that's what many like to pick up and check. And many of you may have read this in recent times, that of course the OED keeps adding what are Indian words to its dictionary, and IO, English, time pass, Vada, and there are several others that have been added to the Oxford English Dictionary. And so it's not that I am saying that we need the OED to validate whether what we are saying is English or not. What I'm trying to say is it's interesting that many of us like to rely on dictionaries like the OED to validate what we use, and what dictionaries like OED is to look at what users are doing. You and I are users. What we are doing in our everyday, what we are doing more of, what we are doing frequently and consistently, and that eventually makes its way into the dictionary. So it's like a whole cycle that we keep repeating and not realizing that you know um, as users of a language, we are the ones who decide. We are the ones who continuously innovate, change, and languages thrive so long as we, as users, keep it alive and make use of it. And part of that means that it's constantly changing. So and that sort of makes me wonder that maybe it's time for us to consider how we can validate our own varieties of English. And, perhaps one way to think of that is whether, with authentic data, whether we can incorporate our varieties of English into a realistic model of teaching and learning. And I think, sort of in this, I don't think English needs to be pitted against the mother tongues. The mother tongue, the first languages, our own Indian languages are very important. That goes without saying. I think that the existence of, or the emergence of, these Indian Englishes, of these regional and social varieties of Indian English, is in itself, it doesn't. I think people very often take that to imply that we are moving away from our mother tongues and away from our own languages at the cost, or rather we are moving towards English at the cost of our mother tongues and first languages. And I would urge you to look at it from a different lens. That it could very well imply that the emergence of these regional and social varieties of Indian English could very well imply something else. It could imply that Indians today are negotiating an identity that is at once global and local, um, and also pan-Indian. And so, that's maybe one way to look at this. And I hope that the takeaway from this has been uh, to consider Indian Englishes, the varieties, to take them more seriously than just being um, a sort of a consequence, or an undesirable consequence of contact between English and our many languages. I think they're varieties in their own light and have much to offer, and probably are uh, going to be very effective means to achieving better results as far as learning and teaching English in this country is concerned. Right? So, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, can I read out the questions now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we have a very first question. It is like, everyone may not have access to English medium schools. Is English becoming an employability factor in India? If so, in what way?
Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, it's asking, what do people who don't have access to English medium schools do, and is this an important factor in employability? Am I right? Is that what?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, um, and this is where it. Um, I want to say that I think it's pointless to blame the language. We need to work on our education system and create jobs before we blame the language. So it's very convenient to blame English and say English is affecting our mother tongues. It's taking away the high paying jobs and so on and so forth. My point is this: for if as a community we are going to advocate only for mother tongue education, that's fine, provided we can guarantee that we can create job opportunities for people who are going to come out of that kind of an education. That seems very unlikely very soon. Of course, the world is changing, and we are, of course, in the middle of situations like we've never seen. So we don't know what's coming, but at least in the near future, that seems very unlikely. Having said that, it depends on what kind of jobs you're looking for. Not every job requires tremendous English language skills. And as for what do people do who don't have access, that's sort of part of the point that I want to make, is that we should be on um, that trickling down that I mentioned of English down that vertical. So that vertical spread needs to go further down, and not associating English at a policy level with its positive aspects, with its benefits. What that's going to do is it's only going to make this worse for people who already don't have access. And there are other ways in which you can access the language. So you have apps now. You have I myself haven't used them, so I don't know. I can't recommend specific ones, but I know that there is a lot of material online. But how effective they are on their own without a teacher, I won't be able to comment on that.
Okay, ma'am. Now we have the next question.
Yeah.
It is about the English curriculum revision that is about to happen in December 2020. And the question is, the curriculum plans to, you have mentioned that there is a plan to separate English as a subject and English as a medium to communicate. So somebody is asking that, will this be good enough? And how do you interpret it?
I mean, to me, again, I have to sort of give this disclaimer that I'm not an expert on curriculum frameworks or language policy necessarily, but to my mind, as somebody who works on languages, I say that um, this bridging a gap, I mean, that alone is not enough. Of course, not enough. Um, but that's definitely going to be useful, bridging the gap between English as a standalone subject and English as a medium of instruction. So when I say that, I mean, a lot of the time, a lot of the material that you find uh, sort of circulating on English languages, say stories, to more of the literature side, which is not a problem in itself. But if the focus is a functional one, if it is about getting people ready and make equipping them with the skill to communicate in a professional setting, in an educational environment, then uh, the way we teach English language has to incorporate elements from other subjects as well. And that alone is not enough. I think that we will need. I mean, it would have to be mass revamp a massive revamp of existing measures. I think, and one thing that I mentioned in the talk was the need to have data. We don't have, so a lot of, so it seems to me that we might be building frameworks and models without having an idea of what is going on the ground. So much has changed, like I was mentioning in the talk today, so much has changed as far as the evolution of English in India is concerned. But we need to know the details, where and at what extent, what kind of groups are using English in what fashion, what are the features, before we can understand the gaps, before we can understand the strong points, before we can understand how to incorporate this into instructional material in the form of textbooks or audio files that can be played out. Before we know any of this, we need the data. So that's why we need more research that needs to happen on English, how English is used in this country.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. We have one more question. Taking into consideration of the higher secondary students of Kerala, the students are allowed to choose mother tongue to attempt exams, and they're not forced to write in English. So, do you feel anything odd about this, and what is your take on this?
So when you say writing exams, writing all exams in Malayalam is allowed, is it? Is that
Yeah,
how?
students can write in Malayalam because in government schools,
Right.
they're allowed to do it.
So this is part of the three language policy. I think that governments have implemented. I'm again not very sure about this from that point of view, but I think that again, if we cannot ensure that the students um, can get jobs on the basis of their knowledge of their mother tongue, then I think we are causing them great disadvantage. If they plan to work in Kerala, then I think it's still fine. But if they have ambitions to work, in another state, in an area of work that would require them to interact in languages other than Malayalam, then obviously it's going to be a grave disadvantage not knowing or not being confident in using English.
Okay, ma'am. We have another question. Uh, it's about the standardization of Indian English.
Mhm.
Does it not be challenging given the kind of divergent variety?
Yes, it would be. It would be enormously challenging. But I think, and also there are other issues, right? How do you choose, like, how usually what happens in the process of standardization is that that's also a power play, unfortunately. So, all in any language, the variety that's seen as the standard is one that is spoken or used by the dominant social groups in that region. So, that is problematic in itself. Um, but the question is, will it be some of the points to consider? And I'm not necessarily supporting one over the other. These are questions that my own mind asks all the time, which is that will it be a lesser of an evil than having no framework or no, or having lots of ambiguity on what one must with the language, or having a sort of a colonial hangover, which is again not a realistic model to frame English language teaching in this country, given our local situations and so on. But indeed it is going to be problematic. But I wonder whether it is worth attempting that enormous taking on that enormous challenge. I think it will bear more fruit than current measures. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. We have another question.
Sure.
What are the challenges in teaching English as a second language faced by professors?
Mm, I think um, so. This is there a mention of level? At what level? At school or no? There's no
No,
level.
no, no level.
Right.
It's
Okay.
just English as a second language.
I think that again, this whole critical age hypothesis is a very um, controversial area of second language acquisition. But having said that, I think that there are more arguments in favor of there being an age range after which learning a second language becomes a little more difficult than before. And so, keeping that in mind, I mean, for example, if you ask me, when we do English proficiency classes for students who are weaker in the English language, one of the things that repeatedly comes to the fore is that you first have to help them unlearn, um, poor instruction that they received. I can't think of nicer words to use. They have to first unlearn, and it's not their fault. It's the circumstances, it's the kind of education system in schools. um, we have to sort of start with wiping the slate clean in terms of helping them unlearn a lot of the poor instruction that they have received, and then start from the basics. And I often we wonder whether, and by the time they come at this level, they have their other core courses to learn, and they want shortcuts. And it's not, again, it's that's induced by a lot of other factors, so I don't necessarily blame the students themselves. So they want shortcuts to quickly acquire language, and unfortunately there are no shortcuts. So that is one thing that I face. I think, the like I said in my one of my slides, policy interventions and all of these are best done at the school levels. They spend such a considerable amount of their time in schools in this apparently suitable age range they spent at schools, and so we might as well try and make whatever change we want at that level. So yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much for answering all these questions very patiently. And with that final question, we are coming to the end of today's webinar. And I would like to thank you on behalf of Additional Skill Acquisition Program and the Department of Higher Education. Thank you for spending your valuable time and delivering certain valuable insights to us. And I should mention that you have covered almost everything in the topic, and you started from the overview of history of English in India and the emergence of internet and English becoming the flourishing language, and and from that you've traveled through time, and you've even mentioned about the notion of correctness and people being judgmental about speaking English, which is very common, I believe, and you've stressed about certain problems also that we face nowadays when we are learning, speaking, and even writing English. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences as well. And thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you to the ASAP team. Thank you, Arun, for extending this invitation, and thank you to all of you who are here today and who helped me with sort of setting this up today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. And sincere thanks to all the participants, and your participation and support is much appreciated by us all. And if you want to attend more webinars statewide, district-wide, you may please log into our website, www.skillparkkerala.in/news and events/webinars. Thank you so much once again. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening, and
You too.
stay safe. Thank you. Thank you.